Behind the golden gates of Versailles, where marble statues gazed upon gardens that stretched beyond the horizon, the most powerful monarchy in Europe was rotting from within. The year was 1682, and Louis XIV had just moved his entire court to what would become the most magnificent palace the world had ever seen. But beneath the glittering chandeliers and silk tapestries, a different kind of power was being wielded. Power that would ultimately bring down 3 centuries of royal rule. This is the story of how sexual scandal became the weapon that destroyed the French monarchy. Our tale begins not with politics or war, but in the private chambers where kings believed they were above both God and morality. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had already shocked Europe by openly flaunting his mistresses, while his wife, Queen Marie-Thérèse, suffered in silence. But what happened next would make those early scandals look like innocent flirtations. The court of Versailles was about to become a playground for the most depraved appetites of absolute power. And the French people were watching. Every whispered rumor that escaped those palace walls chipped away at the divine right of kings. Every illegitimate child born to royal mistresses was another crack in the foundation of monarchy. The aristocrats who lived within these walls believed they were untouchable. They were wrong. Because in the end, it wasn't foreign armies or political revolutionaries who brought down the House of Bourbon. It was their own insatiable hunger for pleasure, documented in letters, memoirs, and court records that survive to this day. Welcome to the most scandalous chapter in royal history, a chapter written in silk sheets and sealed with the blood of revolution. This is how the bedroom became the battlefield that changed France forever. 1. Historical context. To understand how sexual scandal could topple a throne, we must first understand the absolute power that French kings wielded over their subjects. In 1661, when Louis XIV declared, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. The French monarchy had evolved into a system where one man's will was literally the law of the land. This wasn't just political power. It was divine authority, blessed by the Catholic Church and enforced by armies that stretched across Europe. French kings ruled by what they called divine right, the belief that God himself had chosen them to govern. This meant that questioning the king wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. For over 1,000 years, this system had made France the dominant power in Europe. French armies had conquered territories from Spain to the Netherlands. French culture, language, and fashion set the standard for every royal court from London to St. Petersburg. But absolute power came with absolute temptation. When you believe you're God's representative on earth, normal moral rules seem to apply to everyone except you. The court system that Louis XIV created at Versailles was designed to reinforce this divine status. Every morning, the king's awakening was a religious ceremony called the lever. Nobles competed for the honor of handing him his shirt or holding his mirror. Every meal was a public performance where courtiers stood and watched their monarch eat. This wasn't just pageantry, it was political control. By forcing the nobility to live at Versailles, Louis kept potential rivals under his watchful eye. But he also created a hothouse environment where gossip, intrigue, and sexual scandal flourished. The same system that made kings all-powerful also made their private lives public spectacles. And in a world where the king's personal behavior was seen as a reflection of divine will, scandal became a political weapon. When French peasants heard stories of royal debauchery while they starved in the countryside, the divine right of kings began to look like a cruel joke. This was the powder keg that sexual scandal would eventually ignite. 2. Main character. 3 kings would define the sexual scandals that brought down the French monarchy, each one pushing the boundaries of royal debauchery further than the last. Louis XIV, the Sun King, reigned for 72 years and established the template for royal sexual excess that his successors would follow to their doom. Born in 1638, Louis came to power believing that his desires were literally God's will made manifest. His official marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain was purely political, a treaty sealed with wedding vows that he never intended to honor. While his queen suffered through multiple miscarriages and lived in virtual isolation, Louis paraded his mistresses through the halls of Versailles like conquering generals. Louise de la Vallière, Madame de Montespan, Madame de Maintenon. These women wielded more political power than most ministers. But Louis XIV's scandals were nothing compared to what his great-grandson would unleash. Louis XV inherited the throne in 1715 at age 5, and by the time he reached adulthood, the moral restraints that had barely contained his predecessor had completely disappeared. Known as Louis the Beloved in his youth, he would become one of the most despised monarchs in French history. His reign from 1715 to 1774 was marked by military defeats, economic disasters, and sexual scandals that shocked even the jaded aristocrats of Versailles. Madame de Pompadour controlled French foreign policy from the king's bedroom for nearly 20 years. When she could no longer satisfy the king's appetites, she personally recruited younger women to take her place. The most notorious was Madame du Barry, a former prostitute who became the unofficial queen of France. But it was Louis XVI who would pay the ultimate price for his predecessor's excesses. Ironically, Louis XVI was probably the most morally upright of the three kings. He was faithful to his wife Marie Antoinette and showed little interest in the sexual intrigues that had consumed his grandfather and great-great-grandfather. But by the time he took the throne in 1774, the damage was already done. The French people had lost all respect for the monarchy, and Marie Antoinette became the target of the most vicious sexual slanders in European history. Pamphlets circulated throughout Paris depicting the queen in graphic sexual scenarios with everyone from her brother-in-law to her female companions. None of these accusations were true, but truth had become irrelevant. The monarchy had so thoroughly corrupted itself that even an innocent queen could not escape the stain of her predecessor's sins. These three kings represent the arc of royal sexual scandal, from Louis XIV's brazen displays of power, to Louis XV's complete moral collapse, to Louis XV's futile attempts at redemption. Together, they created the conditions that would make revolution inevitable. 3. Major scandal. The sexual scandals that destroyed the French monarchy began with Louis XIV's brazen decision to make his adultery a public spectacle. In 1661, while his wife Queen Maria Theresa was pregnant with their first child, Louis began his affair with 17-year-old Louise de la Vallière. What made this scandal unprecedented wasn't the affair itself. European kings had always kept mistresses, but Louis's decision to parade Louise openly through the court. He installed her in apartments directly above the Queen's chambers, forcing Maria Theresa to listen to her husband's infidelities every night. Court records from the Duke of Saint-Simon describe how Louise would appear at state dinners wearing jewels worth more than most nobles' annual income. But Louise was just the beginning. In 1667, Louis began his most notorious affair with Françoise Athénaïs de Rochechouart, the Marquise de Montespan. Madame de Montespan was married, making this not just adultery but a violation of one of the most powerful families in France. For 13 years, she ruled Versailles as the unofficial queen, bearing Louis 7 illegitimate children. The scandal reached its peak when accusations surfaced that Montespan had used black magic and poison to maintain the king's affections. The affair of the poisons implicated dozens of courtiers in a web of murder, witchcraft, and sexual blackmail that rocked the foundations of the monarchy. Police records from Lieutenant General Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie document how fortune-tellers and poisoners operated openly within the palace walls. When Louis finally tired of Montespan, he replaced her with Madame de Maintenon, whom he secretly married after the Queen's death in 1683. This created a constitutional crisis. France now had an uncrowned queen with no legal status. But the sexual excesses of Louis XIV were nothing compared to his great-grandson's complete moral collapse. Louis XV's reign became synonymous with sexual depravity that shocked even the libertine aristocrats of the 18th century. His 20-year relationship with Madame de Pompadour transformed the monarchy into a sexual marketplace where political favors were bought with bedroom access. Pompadour, born Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, was a commoner who used her sexual relationship with the king to become the most powerful woman in Europe. She controlled ministerial appointments, directed foreign policy, and spent the equivalent of billions in today's currency on her personal pleasures. When age and illness made her unable to satisfy the king's appetites, she established what courtiers called the Deer Park, a private brothel within Versailles where young girls were brought for the king's pleasure. The most notorious of these arrangements was Louis's relationship with Madame du Barry, born Jeanne Bécu, a former prostitute who became the king's official mistress in 1769. Du Barry's elevation to court scandalized even the jaded aristocrats of Versailles, who were forced to bow to a woman they considered beneath their notice. But the ultimate victim of royal sexual scandal was Marie Antoinette, who never committed the crimes she was accused of. 4. Political impact. The sexual scandals of the French monarchy didn't just damage royal reputations, they systematically destroyed the political foundations that had kept the Bourbon dynasty in power for centuries. By 1750, what had once been whispered gossip in palace corridors had become open mockery in the streets of Paris. The transformation began during Louis XIV's reign, when his public displays of adultery fundamentally altered how the French people viewed their king. For over 1,000 years, French monarchs had maintained power through the concept of divine right, the belief that kings were God's chosen representatives on earth. But when Louis paraded his mistresses through Versailles, while his wife suffered in humiliation, ordinary French citizens began to question whether God would truly choose such a man to rule. Church records from the period show a dramatic decline in prayers offered for the king's health and success. The political damage accelerated under Louis XV, whose sexual excesses coincided with a series of military and economic disasters that devastated France. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, cost France most of its North American colonies and bankrupted the royal treasury. While French soldiers died in foreign battlefields, their king was spending fortunes on his mistresses and their elaborate pleasures. Madame de Pompadour alone cost the French treasury the equivalent of over $2 billion in today's currency. Her influence over foreign policy led to disastrous military alliances that weakened France's position in Europe. The most damaging was the reversal of France's traditional alliance with Prussia in favor of Austria, a decision made largely to please Pompadour's personal preferences. This diplomatic revolution contributed directly to France's defeats in the 7 Years' War and the loss of Canada to Britain. Meanwhile, the king's relationship with Madame du Barry created a constitutional crisis that paralyzed the government. The French Parliament, known as the Parlement de Paris, refused to register royal edicts while a former prostitute held influence over state policy. For months, the government effectively ceased to function as nobles and magistrates boycotted court ceremonies rather than acknowledge du Barry's position. But the most devastating political impact came from the systematic destruction of royal mystique. French political theorist Montesquieu wrote in 1748 that monarchy depended on honor and respect, not just fear. The sexual scandals had stripped away both honor and respect, leaving only naked power backed by increasingly unreliable military force. By 1774, when Louis XVI inherited the throne, the monarchy's political capital was completely exhausted. The new king faced a financial crisis that required new taxes, but the French people were no longer willing to sacrifice for a crown they no longer respected. The Assembly of Notables, convened in 1787, openly defied royal authority for the first time in centuries. When Marie Antoinette became the target of sexual slanders, the attacks weren't just personal. They were political weapons designed to destroy the last vestiges of royal legitimacy. The pornographic pamphlets that circulated throughout Paris depicted the queen not just as sexually depraved, but as a foreign agent using her body to betray France to Austria. These accusations, though completely false, gained credibility because the French people had learned to expect sexual corruption from their rulers. The political system that had once seemed unshakable was revealed to be completely dependent on public respect and religious reverence. Once those foundations crumbled, revolution became inevitable. 5. Consequences. The French Revolution didn't begin with political theories or economic manifestos. It began in the bedrooms of Versailles, where decades of royal sexual scandal had poisoned the very concept of monarchy in the minds of the French people. By 1789, the connection between royal debauchery and national suffering had become impossible to ignore. While Marie Antoinette was falsely accused of spending fortunes on jewelry and lovers, real French families were starving because previous kings had bankrupted the nation funding their mistresses' extravagances. The revolutionary pamphlet, The Austrian Woman's Royal Orgy, circulated throughout Paris in 1789, depicting Marie Antoinette in graphic sexual scenarios with foreign diplomats. Though completely fabricated, these accusations gained instant credibility because the French people had witnessed a century of actual royal sexual corruption. The revolutionaries understood that destroying the monarchy required more than political arguments. They needed to destroy the mystical reverence that had protected kings for centuries. Sexual scandal became their most effective weapon. Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a leading revolutionary journalist, wrote in 1791 that the corruption of the palace has infected the entire nation. Revolutionary newspapers like L'Ami du Peuple published detailed accounts of royal sexual excesses alongside reports of peasant starvation. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. While kings satisfied their lusts, their subjects died of hunger. The trial of Louis XVI in 1792 explicitly connected his family's moral failures to France's political and economic disasters. Revolutionary prosecutor Antoine Fouquier-Tinville argued that the king's ancestors had been prostituted the dignity of the crown through their sexual scandals. Even though Louis XVI himself was guilty of no sexual impropriety, he was held accountable for the accumulated sins of his predecessors. The execution of Marie Antoinette in 1793 represented the ultimate triumph of sexual slander over truth. The queen, who had never committed adultery, died because the French people believed she embodied the sexual corruption that had destroyed their nation. Her final letter, written hours before her execution, protested her innocence of all charges. But innocence had become irrelevant. The revolutionary government systematically destroyed every symbol of royal sexuality that had scandalized France. Versailles was stripped of its furnishings, and the private apartments where kings had entertained their mistresses were converted into public museums. The message was clear. The age of royal sexual privilege was over forever. But the revolution's obsession with royal sexual corruption revealed how deeply these scandals had traumatized French society. Revolutionary festivals celebrated the purity of the new republic, in explicit contrast to the debauchery of the old monarchy. The cult of the supreme being, established by Robespierre in 1794, was designed to restore moral virtue to a nation that revolutionaries believed had been corrupted by royal example. Even after the monarchy was destroyed, the sexual scandals of Versailles continued to shape French politics. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power was partly enabled by his promise to restore moral order after the chaos of revolution. His establishment of the Napoleonic Code included strict regulations on marriage and sexuality, a direct response to the perceived sexual anarchy of the royal era. The revolution had succeeded in destroying the monarchy, but the trauma of royal sexual scandal would influence French political culture for generations. The lesson was clear. In a world where kings claimed divine authority, their personal morality became a matter of national survival. When that morality collapsed, so did the entire system of government it was meant to legitimize. Closing. The fall of the French monarchy stands as history's most dramatic example of how personal scandal can destroy political power that seemed unshakable for centuries. What began in the bedrooms of Versailles ended with the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution, proving that even divine right could not survive the corrosive power of sexual scandal. The three kings who ruled France from 1643 to 1792, Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI, created a perfect storm of moral corruption that made revolution inevitable. Louis XIV established the template by making royal adultery a public spectacle, transforming what had once been private vice into state policy. His decision to parade his mistresses through Versailles while humiliating his wife destroyed the mystical reverence that had protected French kings since the Middle Ages. Louis XV completed the moral destruction by allowing his sexual appetites to dictate foreign policy and bankrupt the nation. His 20-year relationship with Madame de Pompadour and his elevation of the prostitute Madame du Barry to royal consort stripped away the last vestiges of royal dignity. Louis XVI, ironically the most moral of the three, inherited a throne that had already lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the French people. His wife Marie Antoinette became the scapegoat for a century of royal sexual excess, dying for crimes she never committed because the French people could no longer distinguish between truth and the lies that royal scandal had made believable. The lesson of Versailles extends far beyond 18th century France. Political power, no matter how absolute it appears, ultimately depends on public consent and respect. When leaders violate the moral standards they claim to represent, they undermine the very foundations of their authority. The French kings believed their divine right made them immune to moral judgment, but they discovered that divine authority requires divine behavior. The sexual scandals of Versailles didn't just destroy individual reputations, they destroyed an entire political system. The concept of monarchy itself became so tainted by association with sexual corruption that France has never successfully restored royal rule. Even today, more than 2 centuries after the Revolution, the French Republic defines itself in opposition to the moral failures of the old monarchy. The archives of Versailles, now preserved as historical documents, tell a story that transcends their time. They remind us that power without accountability inevitably leads to corruption, and corruption without consequences inevitably leads to revolution. The kings of France learned too late that in politics, as in life, actions have consequences that can echo through generations. The bedroom scandals of 3 kings ultimately cost them their throne, their lives, and their dynasty's place in history. Their story serves as an eternal warning that those who wield power must also accept responsibility for how they use it. In the end, the French monarchy fell not because of foreign invasion or economic collapse, but because its leaders forgot that true authority comes from moral legitimacy, not just political force. The gilded halls of Versailles still stand today, but they stand empty. A monument to the truth that no throne is strong enough to survive the weight of its occupant's sins.